But I have some with no hands up even on that. So, okay, good. That's very helpful. Thank you. Let's get started. And I think it's appropriate that I show this first slide. Blockchain is complex. I agree with everybody. It takes a long time. I sort of felt like I gave myself 6 master's courses, graduate courses in blockchain in self-study before I got employed in this space. But if I was to say that there's 4 key characteristics in blockchain, they would be these 4. I'm going to start in this corner and just say that it's decentralized. Basically, blockchains run on peer-to-peer networks. Peer-to-peer networks means no one node is in charge. All the nodes have an equal copy of the entire blockchain if they're full nodes. There's some new stuff coming with light nodes and wallet nodes that we'll talk about in another pitch, not today. But basically, it's decentralized. There's many replicas. There's no single point of failure on the blockchain. And in fact, it's highly fault tolerant through that. You can actually have roughly 49% of the blockchain nodes go rogue. And as long as it's not 51%, everything stays real secure. Secondly, everything's cryptographically secured. So all of the stuff you do in normal web action where you get through a firewall with a password username, it isn't the way we work in blockchain. In blockchain, everything has a public key and a private key. The public key is essentially used as the address of where something is going to go on the, just like 123 Main Street. And the private key is a key that you only know. It's a long cryptographic hash. None of us know what our keys are. We use techniques like password managers and other techniques to keep that straight. And in fact, that's a whole nother topic on how to not lose money by being careless in this space. But cryptographic security. The third thing is that it's an immutable ledger. You can think it's a type of ledger that you can write on, but not, and you can write on to the ledger and you can read off the ledger, but what's written on the ledger cannot be changed, and that's cryptoeconomically secured. And finally, smart contracts. I don't know that smart contracts is a particularly good name. These are programs for computers. For those of you who have computer science backgrounds, they're programs that are Turing-complete programs on the Ethereum blockchain. I mean, you can do arbitrarily complex business logic. Anything can be done with a program can be done on the Ethereum blockchain. So that's my quick introduction to blockchains in a slide and say, hey, okay, so far you know that it's got these 4 characteristics. If you'd move over there on the right, I'm going to just, I guess I can move from the mic. I put one other thing here, and that's just this layer diagram. And all I'm showing is the blockchain that we talked tonight. You can think of it as having 2 layers. Those of you who are sophisticated could talk with me about more layers. But you can think of it as there's a layer of the Ethereum client software. That's the software that runs on 10,000, 100,000 different machines. We call that the protocol layer. That used to say layer. And you can also think of then the decentralized applications. Some people call those, I guess you'll see this a lot. Some people call them dApps. So the point is, tonight I'm going to be talking mostly about that Ethereum client or protocol layer. And it's just useful to know that it exists. It's a thing. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about blockchain. And obviously we need blockchain 101 for some of you. And for others of you, this has all been boring because you know this stuff. I was asked to give a little overview of ConsenSys. I'm going to try to do that fairly quickly. We have pretty audacious goals. We are a group of people who are not just developers, but we're developer heavy. But we are also entrepreneurs and computer scientists, people starting startup businesses, lots of business leaders, a lot of business development people. We are quite serious about laying the foundation for a decentralized world. That's in our DNA. And there's a mission statement. Assemble these tools needed to build and scale. Scale is going to be an important part of tonight's talk. How many of you know that the current Ethereum network is not really it's got a number of things that's just amazing. But performance in today's public chain is not one of them, right?
It's crap.
It's crap, yeah. So that we need to scale it. It can't do the hundreds of thousands of transactions per minute that the Visa network does, for example. So it needs to be both built and scaled. And we think that that's really going to be nothing less than the emerging social, economic, and political operating system of the world. We do that through providing infrastructure, just stuff that you need to make it work, a bunch of products, and we also got called 1.5 years ago and got asked about would you agree to come in and talk to us or teach us or do a proof of concept or help us do use cases to figure that out. So we also got involved in the enterprise area about I was saying 18 months ago, I'll say 20 months ago now. And we've grown that area very rapidly from 3 people to, oh my, I don't know if we're above 70, but it's high right now. So you can think of the company as being broken in those 3 groups. So this says a little more about it. In the infrastructure, we're trying to grow the ecosystem. Some of this we'll never make any money on. We really don't make any money on some of these products that are out there serving you today. Within ConsenSys, let me say it a different way before I say that sentence. There are 8 blockchain clients. 2 of them are active in the main clients that run the production network. Of those 8 clients, neither of the production network ones, ConsenSys or spokes we have spun out have built 3 of them, the Java, the Haskell, and the .NET implementations of Ethereum. We actively maintain currently the .NET implementation, and we also are implementing we're now actively maintaining the existing Python implementation, and the reason I put reference implementation is we're going to do a Python reference implementation as part of supporting the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. But our developer tools are more widely known. How many of you develop in Ethereum? I'm seeing over a half a dozen. How many of you who develop in Ethereum don't currently use Truffle? Do I see any hands? 1 out of the 7. So Truffle has had 60, 70,000 downloads today, and Truffle is the development framework for JavaScript developers of choice. Do you happen to develop in Python?
No, I wrote my own.
You built your own, that's fine. We also do Populous, which is a Python development framework. And we also do the package manager as one of our spokes. Nethereum is the .NET implementation, and I'm just naming a few. We also do identity systems, registry systems, token standards, reputation systems, as well as another thing we offer for free. A lot of developers don't want to spend time syncing clients and getting the network going, so we support the Infura blockchain infrastructure. That is our spoke. Our founder pays the salaries. We're currently 4 quickly growing people who run the Infura blockchain infrastructure, and that simply gives very fast performance to developers without having to worry about things. Even though you'll want to test on the mainnet or test on the test nets directly, you can also test on the mainnet or on the test net directly through Infura infrastructure, get a little faster performance. From a product point of view, we incubate a whole lot of new companies. At any given time, we have as many as 30 or 40. We're developing decentralized applications for the most part, although some of these infrastructure products are also companies that are really literally startups and can spin out if that is what makes the most business sense. Some of the ones you may know are MetaMask. MetaMask, if you don't know about it and you want to touch the blockchain without getting into all the complexity of downloading a parity or a Geth client, you can download MetaMask and run it right off your Chrome browser as an extension. And soon, you won't even need to run it as an extension. Uport's our identity app, currently in developer alpha. I believe Uport is going to actually change the world. Gnosis was one of our spokes for the last 2 years. We use a spoke and hub structure, so when I use a spoke, I'm using the term to say we have a central hub, and we have these bunch of spokes that usually have anywhere from 1 to as many as 10 or 12 developers and business people. And each one of those is potentially an independent startup that we're incubating. Gnosis is the most recent one that we spun out. They became their own independent company about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and they just did a token auction last week. Ojo Music is another, plus many more. And on Enterprise, we essentially do consulting and production and professional services. I mentioned just a few of the biggest clients. BHP Billiton is the world's largest natural resources company. Has nothing to do with, doesn't have to do with mining Bitcoin either, but it has nothing to do with financial transactions. Microsoft Energy it was the largest German IPO last year and was the largest German IPO since 2011, and they're using us. And also now the United Arab Emirates government, a lot of this is more public. The government of Dubai has actually decided that all government documents within the government of Dubai will actually be on the blockchain by 2020. So it's a very aggressive development program. That means if you get a marriage license, if you get a birth certificate, property records, property deeds, building inspection records, it's all going to be done on the blockchain. I only put this slide for ConsenSys for one reason. Some of the debate is about whether enterprise Ethereum is inclusive, whether it's losing some of the beauty of the traditional public chain. And I just wanted to show you from our vision, inclusion for all, from our mission for the planet, the platform. We really see that Ethereum came into existence with the purpose of becoming a world computer. That's all I want to say about ConsenSys, other than to point out that in that green box right over there, I put a small size poster. You'll have to walk over to it, but it's kind of the current marketing view of what is public about our spokes, infrastructure, and so on. So you can go over there and read a little more about some of these and see some of the bullets. I'm going to take questions at the end. So one last thing to teach about blockchains as I move from ConsenSys now into the blockchain is that the public blockchain is known just that, as a public blockchain, or sometimes we use the term, we geeks who are in the space, that it's a permissionless blockchain. Nobody needs to get permission to use the blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, the one you're very familiar with. One way I've said it to friends is Kim Jong-un can write on that blockchain, so can Putin, and so can Donald Trump if he chooses to, so can the mafia cartels, and so can the descendants of the Order of Mother Teresa. We can all use the blockchain, it's public infrastructure. But here's what I want to introduce. Is it possible to clone that code and run it in a smaller blockchain context behind a firewall? Well, of course I can. That's known as a private blockchain. Private blockchains have been with us for a long time. They exist in Bitcoin. They exist usually for test networks. And in Ethereum, they exist in a big way. So we use the term private or a consortium network to simply mean not everybody has permission to get in and access it. With enterprise Ethereum, we're going to talk a lot about that second class, the permissioned or the private blockchains tonight, but I'm also going to say why I think the two are together and important. So you need to know they exist. With that, let's move on to the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So that's ConsenSys. When I began to read the Reddit posts after the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance launched on the 28th of February, I got a narrative in some Reddit post that went just a little bit like this. And this is just an introduction to let you know where the rest of the talk is going. And I have apologies here to J.R.R. Tolkien and to all you serious aficionados of the Lord of the Rings. So here's what I kind of heard. The Ethereum blockchain, like the Shire and the hobbits who lived in it, was short. It had incurred a few problems in its history, but those were long in the past. The story continues. Along come the large corporations and their forces of exploitive centralization, who would like to control the great power of Ethereum. This, of course, is Saruman, who is allied with Sauron, and he would like to constrain the great power for corporate ends. Now, I don't think any of that's correct, and I hope in the rest of my talk to convince you of some of that. But here's what I see it as. I see the Enterprise Ethereum working with the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance and some group of consortium or private blockchains, working with the private blockchain, the public, I said it wrong. And I need to say it right because some of you are new to this. I see the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which certainly is about the business of private or consortium blockchains. I see it as being quite a bit together with the public blockchain. So let me use my metaphor. I don't think that's correct. I see it as a few groups of people. For example, I see it more like these dwarves and these elves. They basically are going to talk, they're going to get together, and they're going to choose to build something that's a little better. Something that will allow groups of people with very diverse interests, corporate interests and private interests, criminal interests and charitable interests, to essentially work together to do commerce and exchange information, even though they are these rather different types of people. And maybe, just maybe, we can build a blockchain world like the Shire, where the outcome is more like that peaceful and bucolic Shire you saw at the end of the story. The hobbits can be happy again. The roads work. The roads can be passed on. If you do criminal activity on the road and you're caught by people or people self-defend, you could be in trouble. But if you're not doing criminal activity on the roads are just working better, those communication pipelines. So in short, I want to take you on this little journey and suggest that I think there's many, many synergies I believe that what is likely to emerge from this complex and growing ecosystem that now has the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance and a number of large corporations supporting it, and also has the public blockchain. I want you to see it as one big synergy and work together and suggest that, it will come out well in the end, that there's synergies. So let's see if I can succeed with that objective. So very quickly, I'm going to jump through a few slides fast. Just a historical fact from last fall, we already had Ethereum being arguably the most popular blockchain. Now, some of you would say, if you look only at CoinCap, you'd say that, well, wait a minute, Bitcoin's more popular in terms of its value, of its value token. But basically, the development community, the developer community of the Ethereum blockchain is just amazing. I'm amazed. I know one company training over 800 engineers in blockchain this year. So that was point number one. Point number two, even before we announced the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, we already had enterprises developing these enterprise-grade blockchains. We'll talk about them in a minute, but BHP is the world's largest mining company. The NASDAQ was doing it, JP Morgan Chase, Banco Santander. Those are just a few of the articles that were coming out. So why does Ethereum make sense for enterprise blockchain? Well, I'll suggest it's all five of those points are quite important. One, it's open source. If you're not familiar with open source, it just simply means all the code, all the source code, the code that has the instructions, in basically a human-readable form for developers. In basically a human-readable form is all exists in open source space, and if you don't trust the binary that's going to run on your computer and make some executable happen, you can download the code as this gentleman does himself, and there you are, right? Download the code yourself and build it yourself, so you can have an Ethereum node that you know what's running in it. It turns out the corporations like that too. It's easy to learn, and I already talked about high development productivity, and developers seem to like it. We're getting a lot of developers in this space very rapidly, and it's a rapidly growing ecosystem. This is not to be underestimated. The public chain provides a lot of innovation in the space. The corporations have noticed that. You can't go into the halls of an IBM, well, IBM's not using Ethereum right now, but a JP Morgan or BNY Mellon who are, and find the most innovative technology across the board being developed in that corporate environment. And they agree. They want the innovation that they see coming out of the public space. But it also scales the developer community. When one company that I mentioned is hiring 800 new developers, or they're training 800 of their people in blockchain technology this year with formal programs, that scales this community, gets it even larger. And then finally, there's this proven ability to tokenize very complex assets. Many of the ones I'm aware of are still kind of under the covers, but it is amazing what can be tokenized. On the Ethereum blockchain, there is a standard. You can look it up. It's called ERC20. It's essentially the token standard that we use in the Ethereum blockchain, and it allows tokens to be created that are always settlable in Ether, which is the value token of the Ethereum blockchain, but they can be tokened to represent anything. We're doing experiments within our mesh where we'll have 10 different tokens for different purposes that are issued to people under certain ways, under certain rules by smart contract, and then can be dished out to others, and they will end up having value. You're already seeing this with some of the Ethereum tokens trading on secondary markets. So I said, why were enterprises using Ethereum? But now I'm going to say, why this alliance? And basically, I would say that many of us have touted, I was one, have been touting the benefits of Ethereum, and in some ways, we were successful. Guys like Kent, guys who've been, you were running this Ethereum meetup since 2014. We've been saying, wow, Ethereum, this ability to do smart contracts, arbitrarily complex logic, and decentralize it, it disintermediates a lot of industries. That means takes out middle people where there's a lot of value being lost to transactions between two end users on a network. So the enterprise space says, hey, we've got some challenges. One was the public Ethereum protocol is not optimized for the private and permission networks. For example, even running a proof of work, the current ConsenSys algorithm that's run on the public blockchain is a proof of work algorithm, and there are limits to how low you can lower the block time. The enterprises are saying, why? I don't need that. I don't want the permissions to be where everybody in the world can get into my banking network, where I'm going to trade money with other banks. So why can't I have blockchains that are 1-second blockchains? block times. So you can see you get some scalability just in faster block times. But secondly, the current Ethereum improvement process, and if you look it up on GitHub, that's EIP, Ethereum Improvement Process, there's a number of EIPs that get proposed by this open source community, but even the Ethereum developers within the public network say it moves the pace of snails. The changes that need to be made sometimes don't get made as well as they could be, and we don't have the fight in the Ethereum community that's going on in another coin community right now. Finally, corporate users of Ethereum have been forced to essentially clone the open source code and then to break and tweak it. So some of you are aware that Quorum, how many have heard of Quorum, open source project? Let me tell you what's interesting about Quorum. There were about 15 hands maybe. Quorum is an open source private permissioned blockchain. Guess who open sourced it? JP Morgan. JP Morgan had never done an open source project in their life. They took the Geth blockchain and forked it, or not forked it, they created a new blockchain with a new method of getting a Genesis block so that they could use it for private and permission transactions. When the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance announced, we actually, on the launch on the 28th of February, we actually demonstrated it. Transactions that could occur between, say, Bank A and Bank C that Bank B couldn't see. But Bank A and Bank B could do a transaction and maybe the regulator could see it. All of that done by cryptographic magic that I won't go into detail. So it resulted in these three problems. Basically fragmentation of the code base, a lack of application portability. So what is written by JP Morgan to run on the JP Morgan private chain can't go over here and be run by some other bank running another private chain, even though the two banks might want to do business. So this lack of portability is costing money. And then the banks realize whenever they lock into vendors, if you have a small market, you get a small number of vendors competing in the space. And so maybe only one vendor wants to support a particular product. Well, then you can get essentially monopoly profits off of that. And it results in a lot of duplicated efforts, ultimately a lot of developers developing twice. So a lot of development is going on to develop the same kinds of basic technology twice. So basically, Enterprise Ethereum is an initiative to do, and we're going to this will get emphasized, we're going to develop a reference standard. We are not developing products. The Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is not a product producer. We are producing a reference standard. We are going to write some code, or our members are going to write some code, and that code will become part of a reference implementation. So we actually expect the reference standard to have both be written in English language or computer science language for a firm and totally testable standard, but it will also have perhaps 2 different reference implementations to prove the standard and that we have compatibility between implementations written in different languages. So anyway, it is for private deployments of Ethereum networks. But this is really key for why I think the Morgan story isn't true that I read on Reddit. It's building upon the public Ethereum roadmap and the public Ethereum protocol, and it's retaining public Ethereum compatibility. That was hard fought and hard argued, but that was what came together to create this. I can assure you that the founder of my company, Joe Lubin, is absolutely committed to the stuff you saw in that vision statement, and he would not be associated with it if it didn't lead to a better world that is actually that decentralized world we're talking about. This just mentions the 3 classes of people that I guess I can point on either side. I got lots of screens. The initiative is driven certainly by some of the largest corporate users of Ethereum, but also by the vendors who sell technology into their price space, and also by startups. ConsenSys is one of those startups. Although we're growing so fast that we may not, I don't know when we have to quit being called a startup. I want to give you a brief timeline, and this will put something with a little personal flavor in it where I fit into this. The real kickoff for the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance was private conversations that happened at DevCon 2. Corey and Sasha, I think you were there, Sasha, and Kent were all there from our Ethereum meetup, and I know others were there. Private conversations where they began to talk about exactly the problems that I just summarized. So basically, it was incubated in the September-December timeframe. There were weekly meetings, tech meetings, and weekly governance meetings talking about principles and whatnot. Decided that they would aim for having an initial in-person in-person summit on December 15th. Well, I joined ConsenSys in the fall, in that time of incubation, and I had nothing to do with Ethereum, enterprise Ethereum. I had heard a lot about it. At that time, I was working mostly in the enterprise space, though, the consulting and professional services side of our business, but only for a while. I got tapped on the shoulder by someone else who was too busy, which is the case in our company. Everybody's too busy, has too much to do. And he thought I could perhaps go hire some people to help work on the protocol. Essentially, our founder, Joe Lubin, was helping to support some of the protocol development work. And I'll show you a picture in a moment. Anyway, we got together over December 15th. Different people who were part of this rough and fuzzy consortium. Nobody could get paid by the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. It didn't exist. So this was just companies choosing to spend their own nickel to do things to advance this. Somehow ConsenSys drew the short straw and got given the job to take the principles that were in a lot of whiteboard notes and photographs and whatnot and turn that into a written document, a vision document. And believe it or not, we were busy and aggressively having phone calls and meetings pre-Christmas and after Christmas and pre-New Year's and so on and so forth. And we did show up indeed with that draft document by the second week of January, or by the first week of January, and we circulated it to the other members. We took that draft document to a second in-person meeting in January, and then we publicly released in February. And right now we are just in this phase of getting the board working and onboarding new members. We have a massive number of new members that are coming. I wanted to show you my one humble brag picture. This was January 10th. And it just happened that we'd been given the job to generate the draft document. So that's 4 of us from ConsenSys. And that doesn't represent our overall power in the Ethereum Alliance, I'll tell you. But it happened to be that we took the job of writing this vision document. And on the 10th, which was the day before the dates I just showed you a moment ago, we had an all-day meeting where JP Morgan offered to do some training on their Quorum product, and we all wanted to see it. And when we were done, we sat in a corner of the room and started going through that with Vitalik. Vitalik was there. For those of you who are new to this space, Vitalik Buterin there in the middle, the young boy wonder, is kind of an amazing teenage prodigy that wrote the white paper that that became the protocol. Let's see, the high-level standard. It became the standard for the yellow paper, which is the detailed standard for how the Ethereum protocol runs. And both Joe Lubin, our founder at ConsenSys, and Vitalik were 2 of the 7 co-founders of the Ethereum project. That's Amber Balday from JP Morgan. This was all like a picture that was taken by one of the bankers, and I saw it after February 28th, so I knew it was public and it was okay. Somebody tweeted it, so I grabbed a copy of it. It was pretty fun. The guiding principles for the Enterprise Ethereum is simply that we're this community of industry experts. We're going to develop some features and enhancements to Ethereum, but we're going to be driven by these needs from enterprises. I'm going to explain later why I think this is good for the public chain. But I've already said a development of a reference standard, not a product. We're focusing on that horizontal technology on the client protocol layer. That's what we're really trying to get. That's the protocol that we think is going to operate around the world. We think the public chain will operate on that protocol because we're going to maintain compatibility with it. They're going to be able to operate together. And then obviously long term, if it makes sense to have one chain, one will carry. You'll see some architectural reasons that we're going to essentially implement Ethereum version 2.0 with more modular code. That's essentially what we're going to do, keeping the Ethereum standards. Keep talking about maintaining compatibility, and we're certainly going to leverage other standards. Certainly, once the EA is formed, there'll also be resources for businesses to get together and talk. That's already happening. The goals were to essentially just be a governance and standard body for this new protocol. Once again, retain compatibility. I want to really underline that. I'm doing that a lot. And to innovate rapidly and to put governance in place that is enterprise-grade governance. I don't want to go too deep into this, but let's just say consortia in general founded by large corporations oftentimes have governance issues. You could probably picture that, right? If you take 70 of the largest financial institutions in the world, and maybe 30 of them only joined because they felt their board needed to have that blockchain word on their marketing documents to say that they're progressive. It gets hard in a room to figure out which direction are you going. We believe we've solved that problem. We think more will come out about that later. I'll say only a little bit today. I'll take questions though and finesse it a little further. But we think we have some enterprise-grade governance, and I'll just say this much. What is the blockchain good for? Well, it's good for making immutable records. It's good for making data store commits that say something happened at this point in time. That's a very good foundation for doing governance. And so we're already in test with a lot of that. So our short-term technical objectives, and I hinted at this earlier, but this is the one slide where I have it written clearly. We want a more modular Ethereum. How many of you are software developers? Do I have 20%? 40, maybe 40%. If you're software developers, you know the term coupling and cohesion. Essentially a protocol that's put together by a bunch of people, mostly in their 20s after the Ethereum white paper, over the next year, rushing to get out, et cetera, often gets some coupling going on. It's not easy to take the existing public Ethereum protocol and just say, oh, I'll remove these two modules and I'll plug in proof of stake. And you can see that if you've been reading the conversations about how long it's taken to get to proof of stake on the public Ethereum blockchain. So we're going for a modular architecture. For those who aren't software people, you can think of blocks, clean blocks that have clean responsibilities and clean interfaces to other parts of the code. So we're basically going to re-implement Ethereum. We will benchmark it with some consensus algorithms. This is practical Byzantine fault tolerance. The point is, it's a consensus algorithm that's very fast and works where you don't have the problem of not trusting all the nodes. So for a private blockchain, it works very well. We've committed that one of our benchmarkings will happen with that consensus algorithm, but we will all, because that kind of shows how fast you can get, but we will also we expect modules to be written by members that will do proof of work, proof of stake, and so on. And then finally, we're committed to having configurable privacy implementation, including permissioning. So what have we done on governance? We've essentially got a foundational legal structure. I've got the documents if anybody needs them, but our Delaware incorporation documents were filed about the middle of February, right before we had the announcement and rollout. Many of the members of the Enterprise Ethereum Foundation are in regulated businesses. The simple reality is if you're Banco Santander in Spain and you're in the money movement business, you're going to have regulators down your throat. So there's a lot of things that you have to do. We had to have a legal entity before we could go public because we couldn't go public and have members really be formally signed and part of us until we had incorporation documents and lots of thousands of dollars of lawyers and so from many companies. We've established a number of core working groups. The bylaws define 6, but within like the technical working group that I'm involved in, we already have formed up 5 or 6 sub-working groups, and we're going from a very bottom-up approach so people can come in and participate in the formation of those the technical working smaller groups on topics like we have one on Python Ethereum, one on the Go Ethereum and Quorum right now, one on benchmarking, one on some of the technology leadership, like in different spaces for the .NET or the JavaScript implementations, et cetera. And then we're establishing a membership model to scale. So we ended up with our phone ringing quite a bit after the announcement launch day. So much so that we had to rework a few governance things. The board hadn't even met yet. The board had to come together and figure out, we got to automate new members coming in. So they've been voting and putting in place that kind of stuff, and new websites going live, and establishing the membership model to scale because we think it's going to get rather large. But we want to build this builder mentality in essence, and the way we're doing that is through the different companies, bring essentially chunks forward, and through a governance process, we will decide, a competitive process really, with other technology, what becomes a part of the enterprise reference standard and what doesn't. And the long-term objective is simply to realize the potential of enterprise Ethereum technology long-term, but to get it started right now. And that's where we really need to be on private permission chains right now. And we keep talking about this ensuring stewardship of the protocol. It just means we're quite committed to staying in sync with the public Ethereum network. I did mention governance already, so what more to say here? We're member-led. We are a nonprofit. Officially, we're incorporated as a United States 501c6, which means we are a trade association. You had to come up with some legal entity that is recognized because, believe me, the Fed and the banking regulators and the Department of the Treasury also wants to know, and you need to be officially in the... We actually did, there were meetings discussing where would you incorporate it. It's a global organization. I'll say more about that in a minute. So it could have actually been in other places, but it ended up being most convenient to get it done in US. We're quite committed to this idea of not top-down decision-making, but the voting is going to be based on contribution in building the technology. This is very vital. There is a sliding scale, so the bigger companies have to pay a little more money, but the top fee for being enterprise Ethereum is $25,000 a year. So that's way under 10% of the fee to be in some competitive consortium network. We're not trying to hire a lot of employees at the enterprise Ethereum level. Rather, the members are going to be doing work. So ConsenSys has put some substantial resource on some work that we're going to be doing, but we see other companies doing it as well. Let them make their own announcements. So they're member-led proposals, but the idea is that voting, there is in our bylaws and our principles, and the board will enforce it to say that voting doesn't come just because you decide to be a member and you've been a member for 10 years. It's going to have to do with what your developer contribution is to moving this technology forward. We think we're getting the incentives right. Okay. Here's my slide where I want to talk a little about why I think the public chain and the private chain are strong complements. It boils down to two arguments. Number one, both are working on similar problems. And number two, I think both chains are at testing ground for each other, but let's break that apart. Both the public Ethereum space is right now working on proof of stake and other enhancements, and the private consortia, corporations, the enterprise, is also working on consensus algorithm. Both need to improve scalability, and they're both doing research on it. Improving performance. So scalability is literally size of the network. Performance is rate of transaction execution. Both are working on verification issues. Both are working on benchmarking. Both are working in how do you make software safe and more reliable? How do we make, for example, the Solidity smart contract language perhaps be a formally verifiable? By the way, one of my new colleagues, who I've become very close to, just kind of coincidentally, we hired just 4 weeks ago, and he's bringing back to life the LLL language that's low-level for you geeks. It's got 5 L's, low-level, Lisp-like language that you can use to write very, very efficient smart contracts. Would that be useful for most of you? No. If a contract's only going to do something to give my kids something on the day I die or a week after I die, I can write that contract in whatever inefficient language I want. But if a contract is a U-port identity contract that's going to execute in the limit, hundreds of thousands of times per minute, you may want that contract to be in a very, very tight bytecode. And so we're already within ConsenSys working on another language, but so are people in the public space. Developer tools. I'm working a lot in developer tools right now, and strong privacy. Zoku has been here, talked about a year ago or in June, before they put out Zcash in the fall. Zcash, of course, runs on the Bitcoin blockchain, but Zoku, who would get, how do I say his name? Zuko, sorry. I only met him once. It was before Zcash was announced, so I was just reading about it. Zuko. Zuko was gave a talk at the Enterprise DevCon 2 and talked about how ZK snarks were awesome for Ethereum. And those of you who are insiders, I won't go into the detail, know that the Metropolis release of the public blockchain is actually going to have some built-in elliptic curve cryptography that's going to support the in order to support ZK snarks on Ethereum. And finally, the two communities are a testing ground. The public chains, essentially the public chain serves as a bug bounty. The value that he talked about earlier, I don't tend to talk much about it unless I have a security point to make. The fact that there's all this value out on the Ethereum network, the fact that today exchanges are happening and trading those value tokens, not just of Ethereum, but of Gnosis and Digix and you name it. There's a lot of tokens. The fact that those have value presents what's effectively a bug bounty, a honeypot that says, hey, hackers, if you can hack this, hack it. Then you have an existence proof after a period of time. It doesn't say it can't be hacked. It says it hasn't been hacked given this time frame, despite this amount of money. That turns out to be a big advantage for the, that's a kind of battle testing that essentially Ethereum has. Ethereum's withstood, for example, last fall, the 35-day consecutive distributed denial of service attacks for 35 days, and it withstood it. Hyperledger has not been tested in that same way. One way to answer the question about private chains, this came across my Twitter feed about 5 days ago, whatever the date is. Dan Finley happens to be a colleague of mine at ConsenSys. He's one of the founders and co-founders and co-leads of the MetaMask project. And Vlad Samfer is a major person, works for the foundation. He's doing the research on Casper, the new protocol for beginning to scale the network. He's one of the lead researchers on the Ethereum Foundation. And Vlad said, hey, does anyone have a reasonable plan for making banking obsolete using only private blockchains? I'm asking for a friend here. And Dan answered in a very good way. He said, well, hey, here's the play. Basically, you just keep selling private blockchains. How many of you want a private blockchain? I hope everybody puts their hand up. It'll help me. You all want a private blockchain in your house or your dad's company or your wife's workplace, whatever. You want your private blockchain. But if I keep selling your private blockchains, as long as they have what's in the quotes there, with the option to hook them all up and hook and do transactions to other chains, guess what you got? Keeps adding. You essentially have the internet, and sure, people can put a firewall if they want to. That's essentially what I just said. The second time is what Jeremy Miller said in his keynote talk on the 28th of February. He said, essentially, if we build this compatible protocol, you essentially have a chain. We're all going to communicate, do value transfers with all of the wonderful cryptographic and lovely distributed ledger, immutable wonderfulness on the public blockchain. But we're going to be able to do that where, yeah, sure, if you want to have a private blockchain and hang off that, you can do whatever you want in your private space. There's no way a public blockchain can prevent that. A public blockchain, once you put it behind a wall and do your private stuff in your own private servers, isn't going to control that. But now you have the clean roads in my Shire, what do you call it, Middle Earth analogy. You've got roads on which traffic can traverse and make things happen. So this is just a summary. I'm not going to repeat all that. I think I've made every point. I've made the open source point. Oh, and then I could make it very clearly this point. We don't think many of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance members want to work in this protocol layer space. There's not much money to be made here. It'll probably be companies that have certain altruistic reasons to do it, because I don't think we have a good plan to show how ConsenSys makes money from putting 3 developers working on this space. We think other companies will work on it, but most of the cool applications will be done between, multiple banks, multiple bondholders, multiple shipping companies, multiple natural resource extraction companies, and we expect them to be working on the decentralized applications, the dApps that run on top of the blockchain. From a who point of view, that's who the members are. I'm not going to list them all. I should explain that there were 30 launch members on the 28th. There is a board designated, and it's a rotating board, and it's got clauses to keep the power from staying too central, but it's going to rotate, and it does. I'm going to be very clear. The board has 11 members, and it says in our rules and bylaws that 6 of those members will always be from large enterprises. I'm done. Just.
No. I can take off.
Oh, okay.
I'm not wearing my glasses.
Oh, I see. I thought that the need for glasses meant that I should have stopped. Well, then there's only one more point to make. You can obviously see some of the large banks, but we cover Asia, Amis and others in Asia, Credit Suisse in Switzerland, UBS in Switzerland. Of course, all the banking, financial institutions that are really large tend to cover a lot of ground globally. Banco Santander is a big Spanish bank. Wipro is a big Asian applying thought. They're a big enterprise consulting firm and enterprise services, as is Accenture. Telindus is in Luxembourg. The institutes is, if I heard the statistic right, something like 70% of the property and casualty, that means your car, et cetera, medical insurance, certain kinds of things. 70% of the insurance in the United States is written by members of the institutes, 30% worldwide. So just that one company, and that was just on launch day. Then you see startups and blockchain vendors in there too. So we had some good press coverage. I don't expect you to know all those. I'm just showing you that the New York Times, Fortune, Wall Street Journal all covered it. those of you who are watching the stuff he talked about earlier, the price did rather start to move quite a bit around that day, I think. And finally, if you are interested in getting involved, you can get a replay of the entire launch day at entethalliance.org. We're adding members right now, and you can send a note to info@entethalliance.org. Any of you in Colorado corporations who are interested, I'd love to serve as a conduit right into the people to talk to if you'd like to. And that's all I have. Thoughts and questions, or shall I start off?
Yeah, just real briefly before Q&A. So the plan,
do you want a mic?
Get out of here by 9 o'clock. When we do wrap up, if you with the orange chairs could put those stack them back up there, that would be awesome. So we'll segue right into Q&A. A couple quick points moving forward, because we want to keep everyone engaged and connected. We do have a Slack. So we'll send the link to that, and send us your email, we'll get you connected on Slack. Regarding Rocky Mountain Blockchain, which again is a way to explore non-Ethereum technologies like dApps, and also
I'll just cut it 15.
We'll send
we can talk for 15. Does that work?
Finally, Denver is a very vibrant place right now for startups, especially in blockchain. So if you're a developer and you're interested in working in blockchain, and especially if you know Solidity with any sort of blockchain background, please talk to me afterwards.
Let me take a few questions since I've
and again, we'll be headed to
off.
Brothers Bar afterwards if you guys want to try hanging out.
Block and a half. Next to REI. Yeah, so reminder, if you'd like to present on Dash or another one of the hot altcoins, come chat with me. If you'd like to lead a team at the hackathon, come talk to me. We are going to be going to Brothers Bar right after this, so we'd like to keep chatting, but we only have the venue until 9. We're looking for, as the group grows, we need more venue, we need more AV. If you work for a company that you think would be interested in sponsoring this type of event, also come chat with me. Yeah, that's about it. I want to say, great presentation. I've been reading about Ethereum.
He gets the first question.
All right. Just when I thought blockchain couldn't get geekier, you threw in the trolls and the...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was good.
And notice I've mixed my metaphors right here.
My question is around governance, and you said technical contributions give some kind of points on governance. So I was imagining like proof of stake, because you were saying you guys are going to test things, and now I'm thinking like GitHub commits represent votes.
Yeah.
How does it work?
Let me try to answer that. The board did not exist literally till about the day before the launch. So we had to get incorporated, we had to get banks and lawyers signing off documents. We get our 11 board members, okay? ConsenSys does have one of those board seats. So ConsenSys is, I guess, an important player. But we like to think we were bigger in the startup and launching this effort than we are in maintaining it. We want to be back in the zone of just moving decentralized mesh. To answer your question, the board's going to have to operate to actually action the principle and turn it into what specific things will count as contributions. So that's not been done yet. That will be done through an open and transparent process. But from a tool point of view, the technical working group, one of the 11 board members was designated as, and this is where the board responsibility stops. The board responsibility names the chair of the technology working group. And that has been named. It's Alex Batlin from BNY Mellon. He's awesome. He's pushing decentralization. He's pushing bottom up. And he has made the call. So all the technical sub-working groups are literally organized from the bottom up. And he's made the call that we will test a product that we, ConsenSys, have built. It's over there on that chart. It's called Boardroom. It's a governance project. And we're 4 months into doing work demonstrating how that can be used to actually literally GitHub pull requests.
Great.
And come up with a governance. So I'll take a couple more questions, and then no more. Since I already answered one on ConsenSys, let's keep it Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, and then we'll shut down. I will be happy to take questions privately much longer, but we'll shut down the meeting in maybe 3 or 4.
So you're talking about setting up multiple private chains for these private institutions. How do you see projects like Cosmos and Polkadot working together with you and making these blockchains communicate together, going forward?
But it's a good short answer because I don't know a great deal about either Polkadot or Cosmos. Well, that's not true. I mean, you saw Tendermint's involved with us. But I don't have a lot of the technical details. That will roll out. They, as members, Cosmos as a member, can be pushing for the proposals and standards that they want to have. In the case of Polkadot, I don't know. And I don't want to pre-announce some things that I know are coming in terms of involvement of people. So I said I'd go over here. Brian.
So, how do you contrast or complement or link to what they're doing in Hyperledger?
The question is, how do we contrast with Hyperledger? I'm going to get an easy answer. I've got a brief on that pretty quick, but I am not an expert on Hyperledger right now. I do understand that Hyperledger is a good, strong project with strong industry support, and obviously is a competitor for doing some of the enterprise solutions. I tend to think that the biggest selling point for the Enterprise Ethereum blockchain, or the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, was exactly what I argued. Compatibility with the public chain is what's going to make that world that I pictured in my metaphor work. But I am not an inside expert on it. Obviously, we as a company, and I'm sure other companies, are thinking a lot about that, and I think I have something on my calendar to get a deep dive in that topic.
I've heard that Hyperledger won't work in a public scenario. It won't work in it. It's not designed to work on protocol.
There was a comment that maybe Hyperledger, I don't know the answer, maybe Hyperledger isn't designed to work in a public setting. I think that makes perfect sense. It was certainly designed for the private space. If you notice, what we're trying to do with the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is to have this pluggable consensus and modularity, so we really think that we'll become the protocol there's a reason the internet uses TCP/IP. It's an old protocol that hung around, and 22 years after the TCP/IP and packet switching came into existence in 1972, and there's a strong analog here with Bitcoin and blockchain. It came in 1972 with what? Exactly one use case and one customer. The use case was electronic communication, and the customer was the US Department of Defense. It didn't do much through the 70s. It didn't do a lot through the 80s. Although packet switching began to change and cause some technology shifts, it became big when? The coming of the web, hyperlinks, etc. And so 23 years later? In 95 is when, and the Harvard Business School is referring to that, TCP/IP packet switching, as a foundational technology, not a disruptive technology. And then on that foundational technology, years later, there was this amazing plethora of disruptive business models, correct? I actually think that's the perfect analog, and the Harvard Business Review people in the February issue said the same thing. Bitcoin, I've been wrongly calling it a disruptive technology. I think that's wrong. I'm adopting the Harvard Business Review world. I didn't mean Bitcoin, I meant blockchain. Blockchain is not a disruptive technology. Bitcoin was a disruptive technology. I'd take that back. But blockchain is not disruptive, rather it's foundational. Blockchain came along as it needed to happen in the Bitcoin space to solve the double spend problem, and you had essentially one use case, value transfer. It does it awesomely. As Kent said, and as I've tried to argue in any Bitcoin, on any Blockchain 101, Ethereum 101 course would argue, Ethereum is about so much more. It's going to be capable of disrupting 1,000 business models. One question more, and that'll be it. Do you think you might?
Yeah, so it seems like kind of this overall talk is talking a lot about private permission blockchains and how those then would fit in. But I don't know that you ever really made the argument that a private permission blockchain makes any sense at all. So I was wondering if you could give us
a great question.
Why that's
That's a very good question. He's pointing out I talked about these private permission blockchains and public blockchains, but I didn't really argue why it makes sense. Let me be clear. If I were to put a title in front of my name, we're low on titles and ConsenSys, so mine makes no sense at all, but I would probably call myself a decentralizing technical project manager or something like that. I'm all about the other. It's just that many of the banks, many of the big customers are not there today. Very simply, if you'd ask your bank in 1996, were they going to let you work with your bank account on that internet? They would have said, what? Are you kidding? Let you access my banking records on your internet? That internet has bad people out there. In fact, haven't you heard? There's pornography and there's criminal activity and there's illegal transfers of money and grandma's getting defrauded on that internet. We're never going to put our banks on that internet technology. What did they do? They all use the internet today, and then they firewall it off with passwords and whatnot. So my point is, there's a substantial number of people and a substantial number of enterprises who there's no way their board, who barely understands blockchain, is going to say, yeah, I'm all for having it on this vision that some of us see. We see this devolving or evolving in the way Dan Finley said. Eventually you have the blockchain internet, the World Wide Web of value, the World Wide Web of tokens. So in their interest, they think they need it today.
Well, and I can see that a bank could incorporate public blockchain, but I mean, aren't you, in a sense, selling a lie to them that a private blockchain gives them anything?
We've had all these discussions in the open with all of those members. So anyway, with that, thank you very much. I'll be happy to take further questions.